All right. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us this afternoon. And welcome to our talk, which will be sort of exploring the question of where the opportunity to make policy durable and climate policy durable, and focusing in on the Arctic as a case study for that. So thanks so much. We have a number of people online, so I'll also just mention, which is my job in this, to mention that the session is being recorded and will be made available after for those of you who are in the room and for those of you who may be interested later. I'm Jennifer Spence. I'm the newly minted director of the Arctic Initiative, and it's really my pleasure to be part of this team and to continue to grow the work that this team has been doing for some time. I think that it's sort of really established itself at this point, and we're excited to host this type of event and to have such a strong group. And I speak when I say that about the panelists, but also many of the people in the room who are going to be joining us tomorrow for a workshop. I think it sort of demonstrates sort of the convening power of the Arctic Initiative and the work that we're trying to do, which really is a unique opportunity to sort of really bring real issues to the table and really ground them. So climate change is often something that is sort of up here and floating around, and we really have a hard time grappling with the impacts of it and what it means. And I think that this type of example and what the people here on this panel will be able to speak about really will help to ground us in understanding the significance of those issues at many different scales. I also think it's a unique opportunity to look at real policy tools and how we develop them and operationalize them in a way that is meaningful, and how we learn from those experiences and how they evolve. And then last, I'm really excited by the people that we're able to bring together. And I think it really highlights that both on the panel and in the audience, we have a number of experts, we have a number of community members, we have a number of policymakers and officials that really have to advance these policy issues on a daily basis. And it really emphasizes the broad diversity of people that we need to have as part of these conversations. And I think that that's the power of this type of conversation, is bringing the diversity of perspectives to the table. But last but not least, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Fran Ulmer, who is an associate of the Arctic Initiative and was a senior fellow for many years. And she is a jewel in the Arctic Initiative crown by no, and that's not underestimating it. Fran has been an amazing contributor to the Arctic Initiative, but also brings with her a wealth of experience, both as a former chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, a chancellor of the University of Alaska of Anchorage, and 18 years of work as an elected official in many capacities. And that's just a small spectrum of the many things she's contributed. And it's absolutely my pleasure to invite her to moderate this session. So Fran.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Jen, and thanks to all of you who have come today. As I look at the audience, I see a lot of familiar faces of people who have been taking a deep dive in the Arctic for a very long time. So when I say the Arctic is changing dramatically, I'll bet pretty much everybody in this room knows that. And it is, of course, primarily because of climate change, but not only. It's also natural resource demand, it's geopolitical competition, it's a host of things, all of which combine to create some very significant challenges, both for the people of the Arctic and globally. And what we're going to talk about today is exactly that, and how strategies, policies, initiatives can more effectively address the things that are really important, not someday, but today. And that is what we hope we can talk about for the next hour. And I just want to say, even though, you know, it's only an hour, we're going to do our best to save some time at the end for question and answer. So we are very lucky to have 4 speakers who have a lot of experience and a lot of expertise in the Arctic. They are people who have some born and raised in Alaska, Some have just spent tons of time in the Arctic and done research and done work with communities and tribes all across the Arctic currently. So that's a very good thing. Each one of them probably deserves a very, very long introduction, but I'm going to make it short in the interest of time. So very briefly, John Holdren will be first, a respected scientist who is actually the co-director of the Arctic Initiative here at the Kennedy School and co-director of the Science, Technology, and Public Policy program here at the Kennedy School, former science advisor to President Obama, former head of the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, on and on. So John will sort of set the stage for us. Then we will move to David Balton. David is the current executive director of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee. That's a mouthful. He'll tell us more about that. But in his former life, he was ambassador for oceans and fisheries at the State Department, and really the lead person for the State Department when it comes to Arctic affairs. And for many, many years was our person, that is the US person at the table for all Arctic Council events. I could say many other things about David, but he will basically tell us about the Arctic strategy that the Biden administration has updated from the Obama administration's 2030 Arctic strategy. Third, Raina Thiele. Raina is the Secretary of the Department of Interior's Special Advisor for Alaska for Arctic strategies. And she has a very long history in the White House, actually. She was there with the Obama administration. She's worked at OMB. And importantly, she has a Master of Public Policy from the Kennedy School. So welcome back, I guess I will have to say. And finally, last but not least, Jackie Schaefer from Kotzebue. Jackie has a very important job with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. She runs the climate program, and that climate program has many responsibilities, including the Center for Climate and Health, the Center for Environmentally Threatened Communities. She's from Kotzebue. We were just talking about people fishing, ice fishing in Kotzebue. She has deep roots in the region that is so heavily impacted by the changes that are taking place. So I'll ask each of them to talk for about 7 minutes or so, and then we will have a panel discussion and open it up for question and answer. So John, would you please lead off?
Well, thank you very much, Fran. And I do have to say, I thought it was 8 minutes rather than 7, but
That's fine.
I'll
That's
do my
fine.
best. As I look out at this audience, I see so much expertise on climate change and on the Arctic that I'm a little bit concerned that everything I have to say is already known to everybody in the room. So I guess the least I can do is try to say it in ways that you will find entertaining, and maybe with a new formulation or two. But my topic is supposed to be, what is durable climate policy and why is it important? And I'm going to start with why climate policy is important and then turn to durability. And so I start with, why do we need climate policies at all? And I want to address that in two parts. The first part, of course, is that the damages from disruption in global climate by human activities, obviously most importantly emissions from the fossil fuel dominated global energy system, but also emissions from agriculture and other forms of land use change, are already frighteningly large. They're growing year by year. The harms include damages to public health from heat stress, from increased exposure to pathogens and disease vectors that are being augmented and spread by climate change. The damages include homes and other property destroyed or made uninsurable by ongoing sea level rise, increases in wildfires, floods, powerful storms, all known to be driven by the ongoing human-caused disruption of climate. Impacts on agriculture and forestry from temperature extremes, drought, and pest outbreaks that are also augmented by climate change. Impacts of the heating of lakes and rivers and the ocean, with impacts on fisheries and marine mammals that are important commercially, recreationally, culturally, and for subsistence. The high social, political, and economic costs of migration away from areas that have been made uninhabitable by these impacts. And all of this amplified in the Arctic, not only by the higher pace of temperature increase there, and I think everybody in this room probably knows that the temperature in the Arctic is increasing 3 to 4 times faster than the global average, but not only is that more rapid temperature increase amplifying impacts across the Arctic, but they are also at particular risk from the faster acidification of the ocean, the shrinkage of sea ice, and the diverse damages from the thawing of permafrost. Those include the sagging and breaking of buildings, roads, energy infrastructure, sanitation systems. They include the mobilization of mercury, long dormant pathogens, long frozen toxic wastes. A long list of damages that again are already frighteningly apparent and in all cases still growing. The second point is that we need policies to help ameliorate all of this harm for a number of reasons, but most importantly, because market forces are not enough. And in many cases, the market forces are making things worse. That's because in the absence of policy, the costs of damages from climate change don't get included in the monetary costs that are assigned to production and consumption in the forms that are driving the problem. And that makes those forms appear cheaper than they really are. The marketplace also falls short because consumers often lack the information or the financing that they would need to make climate-friendly choices that are economic even in the absence of climate change damages being included in the balance sheet. And the marketplace falls short because the impacts of climate change typically fall most heavily on the poor and underserved who lack the economic resources needed to invest in damage limitation or relocation. So what do we need policies to do? We need policies that will help reduce the global emissions of the heat trapping gases and black soot that are driving the global climate change phenomenon, or policies that will help speed up their removal from the atmosphere. These measures together are called mitigation in the climate trade, and I think probably everybody in this room knows that, but of at least equal importance to mitigation. We need policies that speed up the development and the implementation of measures providing preparedness, resilience, and recovery for climate change impacts that mitigation efforts fail to avoid. And those measures together are called adaptation in the climate change business. And very importantly, the policies we need for both mitigation and adaptation have to be crafted to take into account the circumstances and the special needs of the poor and the underserved, who for the most part are the least responsible for global emissions that need mitigation, but are the most vulnerable to climate change and thus most in need of adaptation, which they cannot afford without help. That is most conspicuously the case for indigenous communities across the Arctic, whose emissions are negligible, but whose vulnerability to climate change is probably the highest of any group on the planet, and whose resources for adaptation are today entirely inadequate. Finally, a few words, as the title of these remarks requires, about durability in climate policy. First, avoiding the most extreme and unmanageable of changes in climate through mitigation has to be the work of decades. The global energy system is today still almost 80% dependent on burning fossil fuels in ways that release all of the contained carbon to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide or methane. That energy system could not be transformed overnight, even if everybody in the world agreed on the need to do that. And that, of course, is not yet quite the case. To succeed, I should add that neither can world agriculture or forestry or other land use practices be transformed overnight. These are deeply embedded in economic systems and cultural systems. And like the energy system, there are very large investments that turn over only slowly in the technologies for practicing the development of resources in these domains. to succeed in the degree needed to even come close to the internationally agreed goal of holding global average temperature increase compared to pre-industrial to 2 degrees Celsius is going to require sustaining high levels of both political will and investment without interruption between now and 2050 and beyond. And second, the need for durability in climate policy is not less in the case of adaptation. Even with the greatest imaginable success for mitigation, the range of climate change impacts I've mentioned will be growing in virtually all cases for decades, except for the case of sea level rise, which will continue for centuries. No matter what we do, sea level rise will continue for centuries. Very clearly then, the need for durability in adaptation efforts is acute. But I would add that the need for flexibility is also clear. We need to have climate policies that can last, that can survive changes in administrations, that can survive changes in public opinion in some cases. But we also need flexibility in our climate policies so that they can respond to evolving events and evolving understanding. And so let me just say that how we're going to achieve this extraordinary required combination of policy characteristics, both on the mitigation side and the adaptation side, is an exercise I'm going to leave to subsequent speakers and to the audience. Thank you for your attention.
It's possible because they're having trouble hearing on the Zoom. So.
Is it on now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much to the Belfer Center for inviting me here. I'd like to start by saying I started working in the US federal government during the Reagan administration and have worked in every administration since. And the question before us, how to make policy durable, is one that every administration faces. Not to put too fine a point on it, how can policy survive a change in administration? Is a question that John left us with. Before answering, I just would like us to take a step back and recognize that, of course, what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. What you think about a given policy and its durability depends a lot on what you think about policy at heart. And said another way, a governmental system that allowed any one administration to lock in place policies on a permanent basis is not necessarily a democratic system. On the other hand, as John has pointed out much better than I could have, there are certain societal problems, and rampant climate change is certainly one of them, that are not amenable to solutions on a 4 or 8 year basis. We need long-term durable policies. That is the circle we're trying to square. How to do so? It's not easy. There are tools that every administration has at its disposal. For example, a president can sign an executive order setting in place a set of policies. The next president can rescind that executive order or change it. In fact, there has now been a tradition every first day of every administration. A whole raft of executive orders get put before the president to sign, many of them rescinding the executive orders issued by the previous administration. An administration can use the rulemaking process, promulgating regulations through, for example, Department of the Interior in the case of climate change, or Environmental Protection Agency, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. If you go through the appropriate procedures, they are likely to stand both litigation and perhaps a change in administrations. They are harder to change, not impossible to change, but it is, of course, harder if they are done properly. One can write policies into federal law. That, of course, requires working with, yes, Congress. And typically, both parties in Congress, especially when the Congress is divided, as it is and has been for most of my career. But if laws embedded in policies embedded in law, it's less likely to change, more likely to be durable. Of course, future Congresses can change laws. It doesn't happen as often as that, though. One can also build policies into international agreements, like, say, the Paris Agreement. Of course, that requires dealing with foreign governments and getting them to agree, or perhaps put a little bit more diplomatically, getting all parties to agree to a set of policies that you like as well. And once brought in force, it is not that often that future administrations will walk away from them. But see the Trump administration that pulled us out of the Paris Agreement. Ultimately, the best way to make a policy durable, in my view, is actually to build it from the ground up, start by listening, and to build a policy that responds to the real needs, real interests of the people who matter. And that was the approach, I would say, that this administration, Biden administration, took in developing the national strategy for the Arctic region. It doesn't have the force of law, but it was built with very significant input from the people on the ground, particularly in Alaska, but also in other places in the Arctic, and establishes sort of an overall framework for US policy in the region, not only on climate change, but yes, including on climate change. It's a fairly high-level document. It's only about 12 pages long, doesn't have a lot of specifics. And that is why a year after the Biden administration promulgated it, it developed a 50-page version of it, the implementation plan, which lists next steps for each one of the actions we have committed to. It identifies lead federal agencies. It has language on measuring progress, and it identifies potential external partners. This implementation plan also was built from the bottom up with input from affected people. And for that reason, one can at least hope that politically it will remain durable, despite a potential change in administration this year, 4 years from now, whenever, because it actually is attempting to meet the real needs of the people who matter. In the end, though, Fran, there is no perfect answer to the question of making policy durable. We can only hope that by building policy well, it can stick. And looking back, not in the climate space, but on some other spaces, the effort to create Social Security, the effort to create Medicare, more recently, the Affordable Care Act, those are all very significantly opposed by people at the time, but nevertheless went through. And because they responded to the real needs of real people, they have survived. They have survived. We need to find a way to make our climate policy as durable as those policies. And my hope is that, at least for the Arctic, kinds of things we have set in motion, we'll talk a lot more about them during the workshop tomorrow, will in fact be durable, because as John points out, we do need that. Thanks very much.
Okay, real close. Is this good? Just hold it. All right. Hopefully folks online can hear me. If not, let me know and we'll pivot and see what we can do. Hi, everybody. Great to see you all here. Thank you so much to the Arctic Initiative and to the organizers, to Brittany, to Jen, and Tessa for all the work that you all put into this. I know it was no small feat. There were a lot of moving pieces. And so I really appreciate you all partnering with us to get this on the schedule and to make it happen. My name is Raina, Thiele, and it's wonderful to be back here at my alma mater. I am a proud MPP 2009 graduate. And so it's always great to be back here, even though I will say it does not look the same here as it did 15 years ago. It is totally different. In fact, I was led up here by Brittany and others. And by the time we got here, I had no idea which building I was in. So things have definitely changed, but it's still a beautiful, beautiful campus. I currently serve as Senior Advisor to Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. And in my previous work, I was at the Obama White House as Assistant Director for Intergovernmental Affairs and as the Tribal Liaison to the President. It was in that role that I had the distinct honor and privilege to plan the President's trip to Alaska in 2015. It was a very historic trip. And of course, what was it based around? It was based around climate change and the impacts of climate change. I am from Alaska originally, Bristol Bay specifically. And I'm gonna go ahead and introduce myself in a more traditional manner, which is I introduce who my grandparents were and then who my parents are and where they're from. My maternal grandparents were Gus and Mary Jensen of Pedro Bay, Alaska, and Carl and June Thiele of Alexander Creek, Alaska. My mother is Sarah Thiele of Pedro Bay, and my father is Carl Thiele of Alexander Creek. I am Dena'ina, Athabascan, and Yupik of the Tolchina clan, which is the water clan. And we are salmon people. So when it comes to climate impacts and the topics we'll tackle over the course of the next day or so, salmon is at the forefront of those conversations because it's so greatly intertwined with the impacts we're seeing of climate across the board. And as I kind of look at our relatives, Indigenous relatives across the state of Alaska who are seeing crashes in king salmon and chum salmon, in Bristol Bay, we still have salmon. We still have our sockeye, what we call red salmon. And at this point, they're only increasing in numbers. I'm sure that will at some point change. But to think about my region not having salmon is just, that blows my mind in a lot of ways. You know, I can't even imagine it because that's what my entire life growing up in Alaska and in my communities was based around, the harvest of salmon. And not just the harvest, not just the calories and the dietary piece, but really what that means to us in our cultures and in our communities. Because it really is that kind of tether that brings the community together because everyone is working together to ensure that there's food for folks to eat throughout the year, especially for elders, for folks in the community who can't go out and hunt and gather and fish on their own. These are incredibly important practices that climate change has really limited across the state of Alaska in the very recent past. And I think as we go along, we're going to see much more of that. And it's really heartbreaking. So this is why it's so important to me to be here and why I'm so excited to be here with all of you because this has a really important intersections with the national strategy on the Arctic region because the strategy is very much based in co-stewardship, co-management, consultation with Indigenous peoples, and it really puts that at the forefront of all of these different topics and discussions that it covers. For folks who are not as familiar with the Department of the Interior, I don't blame you, but we are the land managers. So we manage BLM lands, we manage refuges, we manage national parks. We also do a lot of science, and we also have a great deal to do with the federal trust responsibility to tribal communities, not just in Alaska and the Arctic, but all across the country. And so it's incredibly important to this discussion. And I've had the privilege and honor of working with all the folks at this table over the course of my time in the federal government, which at this point is getting fairly lengthy. But I'm just grateful to have had the opportunity to work in these capacities. I think it's important to mention that in my work with Secretary Deb Haaland, she's of Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico. She's the first ever Native American cabinet secretary, which is pretty mind-blowing because the cabinet's been around for quite some time. But she has really had an incredible impact across the department and across the administration, really, in the way that she's been able to influence the framing through which we look at the policy priorities that the president has, that the administration has in general. And our department is very large. It's about 70,000 employees. So it's very sprawling. It's across the country. But what she's been able to do is to set a standard that we really pay much more attention to tribal communities, to underprivileged communities across the board. And even though it's hard to to get there, right? Because everybody has their own way of doing things, and they've been doing it for a long time, oftentimes. And so asking folks to do more or do things differently has been a challenge. It's been an uphill battle. But because of what she has said and how she's sort of framed the conversation with folks in our department, it really has opened up a door, which of course is kind of foundationally built as well on the national strategy and the priorities we have there. One of the most important pieces that we have been working at the Department of the Interior for the Arctic was launched in 2022. It's called the Voluntary Community-Driven Relocation Program. This program is to assist tribal communities that are severely impacted by climate change. So in 2022, we dedicated $135 million to this initiative, mostly to communities in the Arctic, in Alaska. And it's a huge step, because I think when we're talking about durability of policy, we're talking about, not knowing what's going to happen in the coming year. One thing you can't take back, so long as you spend it, is money. Okay, you send out all this money, you efficiently spend it and do it effectively. You cannot really take back that money. And so when we're talking about durability, that's an important piece. And so we've had a huge opportunity with the Infrastructure Act and with Bill to be able to push out a huge amount of resource, both to Alaska and to the Arctic, but across the board. And again, I think that's going to have dividends into the future, because through these investments, we've also developed public-private partnerships, right? With all these folks we've given resources to. And those folks are able to foster those relationships, hopefully keep them strong into the future, and leverage those to continue the work that they're doing. And especially for communities that are having to relocate, which in Alaska is unfortunately many, many communities, as Jackie will talk about here in a little bit. She's the expert on this topic. But we're seeing it more and more every single day. And it's really heartbreaking, because we do have communities that are partially moved, that have new sites that have been established. But what we haven't found yet is the model for how we do this in a way that's going to be efficient and effective for other communities, because what we're seeing in the Arctic, in Alaska, is just the first point, right? Like we're going to see this everywhere else as well. This is showing us what the future is for every other part of the country and every other part of the world. And unless we're paying attention now and making the investments now, we're going to have a really hard time responding to climate impacts and creating more resilient communities. And a huge part of this is having the right people, right? Because that's another thing that I think you can't take back in terms of durability and policy. If you are recruiting and training the right people to implement these programs and initiatives and to get this money out the door, those folks aren't going to lose those skills just because another administration comes in and decides to go a different path. We're still going to have those folks who are ready, who have the skills, who have the experience, and who are ready to continue these initiatives when the opportunity presents again. We also have a very significant focus on subsistence, traditional activities in Alaska. We've been thinking about this for a long time within the department, all 3 years that we've been there, really. And again, kind of going back to the salmon issue, there's a piece that we have as the Department of the Interior, but what has been a challenge is that we aren't the only ones who have a responsibility for salmon management, right? The state of Alaska has a responsibility, our other agency partners have a responsibility, the international community has a responsibility. And so when it comes to trying to find solutions, we end up with these very siloed initiatives, right? Where we need to bring all the pieces together. And that's part of why I think the national strategy is so important, is because it helps to break down those silos, right? The number of meetings that Ambassador Balton has hosted over the past 3 years, I mean, if we added them up, it would be a lot. And that's the federal family, that's folks externally. And so having those opportunities to share information, to create new initiatives together that are complementary is incredibly important. And so I'm just really excited to be here, really glad that you all are here, and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
He was so kind, he left it on for me. Yeah. Okay, 7 minutes. Let me do my introduction. I'll try not to take up 7 minutes. Ulalotok, mga chika Catalina, nalakmichiska Jackie Schaefer, inyupainurunga, anurunga kikitag from me, anayakaka makiklu, kipkinyalu, atataga, iglukuklu, aguchuklu, mayaklu. I'm Jackie Catalina Schaefer. Jacqueline Schaefer is my tax name, and Catalina is who I am. I was born and raised in Northwest Arctic, so just my lived experience in the Arctic has a lot to do with my so-called expertise, but really it's just my life. And I currently am the Director of Climate Initiatives at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Network. And at the consortium, we are the statewide tribal health network for all Alaska Native people and American Indians in the state of Alaska. I like to remind everybody that, when we focus on, especially, I love the national strategy, I refer to it a lot, especially when I'm speaking about our unmet needs for environmentally threatened communities in Alaska. This is twofold. And when it comes to policy, you can't just throw money at things. You could throw money and you could spend the money, but it may not be effective. And what we're seeing in Alaska is a lot of money and we're not prepared for the changes and for the challenges and the obstacles that our communities face when it comes to responding to climate impacts. We are a nation that is about waiting for disaster to happen and then coming in with disaster recovery. We are not good at planning for safety beforehand. So we've been a very reactive nation in nature. But what we have is the opportunity to work with indigenous populations to look at how the adaptation for, say, my family in the Northwest Arctic, who have been there for 500 generations or more, have lived in that same geographic space on the planet and adapted through much change. Yes, we haven't had this size of population that we do on the globe now, but they still adapted. And I am privileged to still eat the traditional foods that my ancestors ate. And so, but it wasn't just Western contact, because I come from a region that was high in trade. We had commercial trading for, well, let's just go to science, because science has to prove everything, right? So science proved and found that we had Italian beads that were traded into our region that were 17,000 years old, 12,000 years old. They were found where we pick our blackberries, our crowberries. And so when you think about that, that wasn't the issue. The issue started when America decided to take Alaska, which I'm very grateful for. But our communities were established on fragile ground to begin with. And so every community in Alaska is either on a river system or on the coast. Alaska has more coastline than the entire continental US. And they found people there in the summer when they were harvesting their fish. And so they established communities. And it was done through the US government, through religion. And so you had religious sects that came up, paid for by the US government to save the people, kill the Indian, but we weren't Indian, but whatever. The point is we have to acknowledge history for what it did to Alaska. Every single community in Alaska is on fragile ground. And now with the changes and the increased acceleration of climate impacts in the Arctic, every single response system doesn't fit. And so really it's looking at it through that lens of historical data, because we know that people before, they were migratory and they moved with the animals and the food resources, which when you tie it into subsistence and our way of living, That's not just food security. That's physical activity to get you there to do it. You have to actually hunt and gather. You have to preserve, you got to store, and then usually share. And so there's this holistic fashion that happens that's spiritual, mental, physical. It's everything about humanity. And so we have much to learn because the convergence of science and indigenous knowledge is still not 100% there. And so what a better opportunity then to look at policy, which is that rigid governmental line that created the issue to begin with, and how could we make it so that it's more adaptable, durable, but also more appropriate, right? So policy, the definition, this, and words mean things, matter to me. No, very few words in the climate world are translatable into our languages. We have over 20 recognized languages in the state of Alaska and over 200 dialects. And if you can't translate what you're talking about into their language, you're missing the boat, right? Especially in the most vulnerable communities, which are on the lower Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. Their first language is Yupik. And if we are coming in with scientists, experts, data collection, and we're using words that are not translatable and maybe not even interpretive, we're already missing the mark. So if I were to bring any federal policy, even the national strategy for the Arctic region to Arctic communities and had this type of forum, it would be very difficult to have a conversation with the people who really are impacted by that policy. And so, and I say all this not in a negative tone, but as an opportunity to really acknowledge the layers of trauma that our people have been through, but also to really focus on the ingenuity and the ability to adapt through time. So in our communities, we've been labeled, all of our communities in rural Alaska are labeled as underserved and poor. Well, we weren't, it depends on how you define, words matter, right? How you define poor and how you define rich. In our communities, if your freezer is full, you are rich. If your freezer is empty, you're poor. Very different. It has nothing to do with money. It has everything to do with sustenance and life. If you define underprivileged or underserved, our communities were colonized, but they weren't modernized. So if you're going to declare a disaster on communities that are not at the same standard as the rest of America, every single one of our communities should be declared disasters until they are. And so it really is just how you look at it. So, you know, the national strategy says Arctic region. And so the only reason the US is part of that discussion is because of Alaska. But it's far more than that. What happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It's a global imbalance that's being created by these negative cycles that are it's gonna impact everyone. So if we could find ways to respond and create policy that is adaptable and appropriate, then we have the opportunity to not just throw money at things, but to really make an impact that then we could look at those lessons learned and have a plan for the rest of the nation so that we are prepared to respond to climate impacts.
What a great panel. I mean, I think each and every one of you have given us something to think about that we will take with us as we leave here. But we're not leaving here yet. We're going to have some question and answer time. And I'm going to start with one or two quick questions and then open it up to you. And just so that you know what's happening, at about 5:15, the doors will open and we will have a happy hour kind of mix and enjoy each other's company. So that's how much time we have. So Raina, I wonder if we could take a slightly deeper dive into co-management and the initiative that the Department of Interior is pursuing, whether it's in parks or BLM or whatever, to try to empower and enable that to happen in an effective and durable way, as opposed to it just, getting talked about, but really on the ground practically be implemented?
Great question. Thank you, Fran. And it's one that we grapple with every day. Is again the kind of question of durability. How do we have these wonderful policies? There's a lot of great planning and staff work that's gone into all of this. But especially when it comes to co-stewardship, co-management with tribes, indigenous co-management, co-stewardship, which generally it has a couple of different meanings. Maybe at the outset, I'll kind of talk through that a little bit. This has been an evolving term over multiple different administrations. So even just in the Obama administration, the term was cooperative management. And what that meant, it wasn't full co-management. Co-management means that you are actually partnering, the federal government or the state government, whoever it may be, is partnering with tribal communities to make decisions together about how to manage federal lands and the natural resources that are on those federal lands. Co-stewardship is the term we're using in this administration and with the Secretary of the Interior that we have right now. In the way that I think of co-stewardship is a bit more expansive than all of the previous terms, right? It's not just kind of these co-management structures. Many of them, for Alaska at least, have co-management bodies that are founded in federal law, in international law. Co-stewardship takes an approach which is we are going to try to work with tribes across all of the different initiatives that we have. So that's doing science, right? Doing testing in our streams, tracking different species and how they exist on the land. All of these things that are currently done mostly by the government or by universities, by researchers, we're trying to ensure that we can work with tribes to co-steward those things. Because when it comes down to it, we're trying to find better ways to integrate indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge into Western science, because Western science underlies much of what we do for the administration. But we also recognize that indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge is all incredibly important as the Western science. One thing I found in this position, I'm the first Alaska Native to hold this position at the Department of the Interior, which has been really interesting for me because I found that in the work that we do on lands management, every single issue we work on has a major piece that relates to indigenous communities. And I kind of wonder in the past how this worked for folks who didn't necessarily have those connections or that kind of knowledge that you grew up with, right? Kind of understanding rural Alaska and the subsistence economy. So it's been a really wonderful experience being able to work with a secretary who is committed to indigenous communities and who wants to see these changes made and wants to see us pursue these co-stewardship agreements in a way that is durable, because once you can train folks at the field level who are land managers on the ground in how to do these things, the more staying power that they have. Even just in the recent past, we've been pushing folks to kind of look at ways to work together with indigenous communities, with local communities, and we come across all sorts of barriers, right? Even though it's our policy, we have legal barriers that folks bring up. There's like novel legal interpretations that have to be worked through. And so once we work through all those different pieces, those roadblocks that present, I think we create a durability because folks now know how to do those things. And it's going to hopefully last into the future.
Thanks, Raina. Dave, could you talk a little bit about the Arctic Executive Steering Committee? Because when most of us think of the federal government, maybe we think of one or two agencies that we've worked with over the years, or maybe even worked for. But when you think about all the federal agencies that have some responsibility in Alaska or in the Arctic, it's mind-boggling. I mean, we're talking dozens. So how do you get them all together, and how do you get them to work on these initiatives in a way that actually is effective?
I'm still trying to figure that last part out, truth be told. President Obama signed one of those executive orders creating an entity within the White House to try to bring together something like 18 to 20 different federal agencies, pretty much everyone you could name and a bunch you couldn't name, that have some responsibility in the Arctic, either just domestically in the US Arctic, meaning Alaska, or internationally as well in what we call the circumpolar Arctic. John Holdren was the first chair of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee. It only got launched then in the second Obama administration. It did some very good work. Then under President Trump, it sort of went dormant. Under President Biden, the word we've used is we've reactivated it. And yeah, they drug me in to try to be the chief herder of cats. It's just as I was talking about a bottom-up approach to produce the national strategy, there too, for running the AESC, the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, it's all about building relationships with the people in these agencies, hearing what their needs and their desires are, figuring out how to make them work better together with each other, trying to get them the resources they need through the President's budget process and working with the Office of Management and Budget to that end, and trying to charm them into doing what I want them to do. And Raina could sort of speak to how well that's going. Very candidly, I would say in the beginning of the administration, there was a very sincere desire, it seemed to me, a lot of energy to try to work better together as a federal family. And as time has gone along, my impression is maybe this is natural in the course of administrations, a kind of retrenchment and moving back into corners. But now we're actually in election mode again, and there's a desire to make the case that what we have been doing has been useful and worthwhile. And there once again seems to be a coming together in an effort to do that. I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's where we are.
Thank you for your honest answer and for trying. Not an easy thing. So I have a question for both Jackie and John as well, but before I do that, I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience, and I'm sure there are some. Yes, Martin, go ahead. And if you would identify yourself and speak loudly and maybe take one of these mics so that the Zoom audience can hear your question.
Thank you. My name is Martin Jeffries. I'm retired, so I don't have an affiliation. I am the chair of the research board of the National Academies. I lived in Alaska in 1985 through 2006, 21 winters and Januaries. So words like co-stewardship and co-management and all those terms and phrases are quite familiar to me, and they never seem to be properly or well resolved. And for Raina, then, my question is, has there ever been an experiment, either at the state level, state of Alaska, or the federal level, where Fish and Wildlife or Fish and Game has said, we are going to let you, the indigenous people, manage this population of caribou or bear or moose? And if there hasn't, why don't they trust? Why the lack of trust in doing such a thing?
Thank you, Martin, for that question. There has been a lot of conversation around this for a long time, as you're aware. I would say there are a couple of examples, again, kind of based in international law and in federal law. Like there's walrus co-management, there's polar bear co-management, other marine mammal co-management. And so those are basically true co-management. Like they actually make the decisions, help to make the decisions on management of those species. So that's one example, is all those co-management bodies in Alaska. I think we have not gotten there for other species in Alaska. We certainly have opportunities at this point. You know, we have heard from folks in the North Slope Borough, they want to have a co-management approach for caribou. So that's one example that we're looking at right now. But I think I can speak for the secretary when I say that we would absolutely love to pursue something like that. One thing that we come across, which gets difficult is that we cannot outsource federal functions, like essential federal functions. And so when we try to do that, there's kind of a blurry line about what falls into that category. And that's what we often come into as an obstacle when we try to pursue things like that. Because when we're talking about management of species, we can also be talking about law enforcement, which is a function that, at least thus far, legally, we cannot outsource that. So we're working on creative solutions for how to do that, but we have a ways to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, sir. With the mic.
Hi, thank you all so much for your comments. My name is Hannah Phillips. I teach over at the law school on environmental and climate issues. And Jackie, I really appreciated your distinction about making policy more appropriate. And I was wondering if any of you that maybe starting with Jackie could talk about some of the policies that you see that are inappropriate and places or areas where you would love to see change and what that would look like.
Thank you. I think it's twofold. Is this on?
Is that on?
Oh, yeah.
She didn't leave it on for me, no. Dave did. Yeah, I think it's twofold. I thought about this when I got the invite to come because I'm not in the policy world, but I'm on the flip side where I'm trying to navigate technical assistance for tribes and policies and program restrictions or barriers to accessing funding or, and the more I thought about it, the more I recall my father saying that, we banded as tribes and went to DC and asked for 100% of our land. We got 11%. So really, and even in the case of New Talk, you look at, they had to do a federal land exchange, negotiated, had to go through Congress 7 years before they could even procure safe land and safe landing for their community. And so there are many. When you look at the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act or even the Lands Act, both of those create barriers for tribes, even though they were put in place to help tribes. And the hard part of it is what part of it doesn't work, right? Because that's usually the barrier is if some of it works, we're going to keep it because it's doing good. But if some of it doesn't work and it's really impacting people that it was designed to help, then it totally breaks the Webster definition of policy. So to me, I kind of stand like on that line of it's really hard to just call out a bunch of policies because we certainly have two really big ones that have sent a lot of money to Alaska right now that have many barriers. And some of the barriers are within the policy itself. And some of the barriers are systemic barriers that are embedded in federal agencies and big agencies that don't talk to within their own agency to each other. And so it's riddled throughout. And so I don't know that I could answer that question and call out a bunch of policies that don't work because I think all of them, the intention was good. So there are bits and pieces that work, but there are a lot that doesn't work. And I think what we have the opportunity to do is no one is really focused on the Arctic. Like this strategy calls out, this is the Arctic region, right? So that means Alaska. And I see federal agencies and stepping up and sitting at the table with state organizations and tribes and saying, let's talk about this. What can we do? And that to me is probably the effectiveness of having bad policy that sometimes works.
Other questions? Yes, Paul.
Paul Berkman, Fellow of the International Science Council. Thank you all for your comments. In thinking about climate, we're talking about something that's at a planetary scale. And as John indicated, the time scale is decades to centuries. We have an analogous type of discussion with open science as an inclusive process that would operate across nations, allies, and adversaries alike on a planetary scale. Are there things that we can do as a society to enable next generation leaders to provide the continuity that is difficult for governance to accomplish, in the sense that recognizing that many of the people in this room may be alive in the 22nd century. How do we enable the capacity for them to achieve that durability, that resilience that is difficult for government?
Well, I'll take a shot at that. Thanks for a very tough question. I think this relates in part to a point that Dave Balton made, which is that for policies to be durable, they have to be built from the ground up. And for them to last, you need to make a big investment in education and training of the wider public and of the next generation of leaders. Because otherwise, what emerges from the ground up is not going to be effective, not going to be usable. And we are still not making a sufficient investment in the education of the public, nor are we making a sufficient investment in the education and training of the next generation of leaders. But we're working at it. And this is something that the Arctic Initiative here at the Kennedy School has a major focus on, the education and training component. Every pillar of what we do, whether it's permafrost or infrastructure or ocean issues or biodiversity, every component of what we do has an education and training element, has engagement of indigenous people, as well as a variety of disciplines. And my argument would be that the investments we need to make in training the next generation of leaders and in educating the public all have to be informed by this interdisciplinary, intersectoral approach. I'm reminded of something that President Obama said at the first cabinet meeting. He said, our challenges are so great and our resources are so limited that our only option is to build partnerships, to build collaborations across governmental departments, across layers of government, across sectors, public, private, academic, NGO. And I think that was an insight that informed a great deal of what we did in that administration. I think it holds in the Biden administration. It was, of course, abandoned in the administration in between. But we got to keep pushing on that approach: partnership, interdisciplinarity, intergenerational understanding, and the recognition that these are problems that are going to be operating over decades, and as we've said, even over centuries.
So I might try to add a little bit to what John said. Underlying your question, Paul, I suspect has to do with the relationship with Russia at the moment, because the governments, including our government, that work on climate science in the Arctic have lost a key partner. We aren't working as a government with Russia at the moment, and I don't know when that will change. There are some limited exceptions to that. The space station is still in the sky, for example, but they're few and far between. That doesn't mean that individual Americans and non-governmental organizations can't, this is a discussion we were having earlier, Paul, keep certain pilot lights lit. Connections with individual Russians or Russian institutions that are below the governmental level, where relationships can be somehow sustained in hopes of a better future, when it might be possible for governments, once again, to work with Russia on, for example, climate science in the Arctic. We are losing a lot of data from Russia. We're losing a lot of sort of the collaborative work that had persisted right up until 2022, despite a lot of frictions about other places in the world, but now has largely ground to a halt. It's one of the key problems we are facing at the moment.
One more question, anyone? Okay, so I'm gonna ask, oh, sorry. Okay. Please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Eleanor. I'm the assistant at the Harvard Project on Indigenous Governance and Development. I have a question for Raina and Jackie. It's great getting a zoomed out point of view on this. I was wondering if you could zoom in to how the relocation coordination is happening and kind of positives and challenges for making sure it's done properly. And consulting with the communities.
You want me to start? Okay, so there have been many challenges and many stop and goes. Something else that really comes to light is when you talk about government and policy, we have tribes governing people and corporations owning the land. That right there is a barrier. It's a barrier because you have pit family against family. And so in the case of Newtok, they've had some struggles. So they haven't really had 100% consensus. They've had 50% of the adult population that are part of an unrecognized tribe that have been fighting to take back the power of the current recognized tribe. And that has never been mitigated. Nobody's been able to break down that barrier. So within community, that's one layer. Second layer is you have pots of funding that goes in, and because they are Yupik speaking first and tribal way of life, they don't have the expertise, so they consult everything outside of their community and their region. And so what you have are consultants that don't understand the culture or the place. And so consultants come in and with designed houses and build houses that are inappropriate for community. And there's no oversight because this is part of that tough discussion of tribal sovereignty. How could you be a sovereign nation and make those kinds of decisions if you don't even speak the language of the nation? Nobody wants to address that issue. So there's that issue. So are there lessons to be learned here? Yes, many. And we have, we're working with that community currently to look and address, we're working with BIA as well as DOI to really, Dena'ina Commission, identify all those things. And so there are many lessons learned here. Could we do it right? I don't know that we can because we have no privilege of time. We need to get people moved to safety before we figure out what we've done wrong.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one of the things that is especially difficult because we're kind of handling this from a interagency perspective, and not just interagency federally, but also with agencies at the state of Alaska and local governance, tribal governance, corporation land ownership, and how they want to proceed. So we have this multi-jurisdictional issue, which makes it all very complicated. And I think with that complication, there's also what folks don't think about as they approach these issues, which is, and one of the lessons learned really is that every community is different, completely different sometimes. So there has to be a unique approach in many ways and a flexible approach for each of those communities, which people don't want to hear. They want a cookie cutter. How can we box this up and ship it out and like replicate it all over the place? That hasn't worked so far. So that's one of the major issues. And I think for the agencies, we have issues with how our funding is appropriated and how we push it out, right? It's bucketed into these very specific buckets for how it can be used, right? So say you go to the Department of the Interior and they tell you, well, we can't build you this house that you want, but once you find funding to build a house, like we can weatherize it for you, right? Like there are these huge gaps that exist, which are never going to help us to build these entire communities because we don't really have a department in the federal government that can build an entire community. And we're really going to have to break down some major silos in the funding world to fix that at some point, or we'll maybe need a new department or a new program at some point to address these things because the funding is not flexible enough to fill all of these gaps. Then we're like going to the state for these gaps, or we're going to the private sector for these gaps, right? And it's just, you're going to have a really hard time replicating this process for a large number of communities, which is necessary in Alaska. How many threatened communities, we have like 150. I mean, it's a huge number. So if we're going to be successful, we're going to have to solve those problems.
Oh, we are out of time, so we don't have time for more questions, including mine, but I'll ask you later. And I would just say that, you know, even though I kind of hate to leave on a challenges and problems note, I do hope that what you will take away is not just the challenges and problems we have talked about, but also the sense of urgency. The sense of urgency that talking about policies and implementing them, given the climate change imperative, not just in the Arctic, not just in Alaska, but in our world, requires each of us in our own way, whatever that may be, to lean in to the dialogue that has to take place if there's going to be community and societal support for not just the money, not just the initiatives, not just the programs, but for the durability for the longer term. I mean, John and I are old enough to remember when the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Environmental Protection Act and all of those fundamental building blocks of protecting our environment when they were passed. And even though they get nickeled and dimed and complained about, and there are attempts to amend them, they're still with us and they're still doing yeoman's work in keeping our society livable. Why? Because an awfully lot of people, health providers, NGOs, churches, all kinds of people will lend their voice in support of maintaining those important policies when push comes to shove in the political process. And so I would just urge you, as you think about these complex issues of how to come up with the right policies, the workable policies, and the durable policies, you also think of the role that you might play as an individual in making certain that they do last for the next generation. On that note, let's go party.